Welcome back to the sculpture. We're going to do another sculpture. As you can see, I started with a base and a plastic on top. It's just a trash bag. And I'm using grog clay once again. Maybe in the next sculpture, I'm going to do an oil-based clay or maybe a wax just to kind of vary it up. But I really like water-based clay. It just doesn't get enough due. It's so flexible, so cheap. It's extremely affordable for just about everybody in the world. So I'm going to start with the block because my pose is a new pose that I got from ArtSpace, and it's a male model that's sitting. I've been doing quite a few female poses, so I decided to change it up just a little bit. What I like about the male physique is that you can learn a whole lot more about anatomy. And in the beginning, it's always difficult, especially if you're not using an armature. And I tend not to use an armature. So I compensate by having these sticks that I put like in the feet just to kind of help me prop it up while I'm sculpting. I eventually remove those and allow the clay to harden up just a little bit as the skeleton becomes more apparent. I add clay slowly in the beginning, but I am trying to create just the proportions and the gesture of this sculpture. It's kind of complex because he's got his arms above his head. That creates a lot of challenge, but it also creates a lot of interest. With challenge, you only get better. You want to do things that are difficult and kind of push yourself through. Often I found myself giving up, but I give myself a lot of time, and even if I don't want to work on something, I just keep pushing myself to do it. The more you work on it, the better it becomes. It does help to have somebody to look at your sculpture along with you to give you pointers. And there are many great sculptors online that will provide you with some valuable critiques. I've used up pretty much 25 pounds of clay at this point. The great thing about water clay is that you can remove the insides eventually and have a lot of the clay go back into the bag. I'm indicating where the pectoralis is there. Now I want to indicate where the spine, and now I decided to just remove a little bit of the base. It was getting too wide. You don't want your bases to compete with your figure groups. So a lot of times I like to make the bases large and then cut down as I need it. I add clay slowly in the beginning, especially on the top, and I've only indicated a little bit of what the head is for positioning purposes. But I don't want to add too much weight on the top because everything is going to be collapsing because water clay has got so much weight and is constantly pushing down. And you always have to keep that in mind. I'm always adjusting the sculpture. The spine wants to fold forward, so I keep pushing it back. At this point, I added the right arm. This takes quite a bit of finesse to get the arm at the right angle, and I'm having quite a bit of an issue. And that right arm is not really rested on the head, but I'm going to connect it anyway because I want to be able to have the clay not dry out. If you left an arm just sticking out and it's water clay, it's going to be extremely hard or gets much drier than the rest of the body. So it's better to connect it with something or make it a little bit bigger and connect it at the base so it has a lot more water in it. You want to keep your sculpture nice and wet, but the problem is that it's a constant fight. You want this part, the gesture, the skeleton of the sculpture, to be just a little bit stiff, but at the same time, you want to get in and sculpt the muscles. One of the problems that I usually tend to have is that I want to go right away. I want to sculpt the deltoid, the triceps, everything. But the problem is that you go too fast. So I learned to move it a little bit slower. I can sculpt a lot faster. But the problem is that if the skeleton is not right, nothing else is going to be right. It's the foundation that's more important than the muscles on top. If you get the foundation right, the muscles just fall into place. But that's easier said than done. It's very difficult. Sculpture is a very hard medium, and it's a medium that not a lot of people do these days. And I think a lot of times sculpture is becoming much more digital because of video games. So there are great artists that work digitally in sculpture. If you're interested in learning about 3D sculpture, you should think about looking at ZBrush and Blender. Blender is a free program out there. ZBrush, you have to pay, but it's really very fluid. It's very much like sculpting clay. I decided to do something a little bit different. I wanted to provide some support for the figure because it keeps dropping. Clay is pretty heavy, so I take this pipe, and it's just a pipe that I had welded together, and I fit another pipe in the cross section, and I just basically skewer the model. I think you can buy these things, much better versions, but the idea is just to kind of hold the sculpture up. I've even made sculptures that can be held from the top down and hold it up that way, because the pipe itself is kind of intrusive. You want it to be far away, but yet it's very difficult to spread it out a little bit more from the sculpture. So this way, that pipe is going to hold up that torso while it dries just a little bit. You do not want to leave that pipe there for a very long time because the clay will shrink and it will wrap that around that pipe. It's going to be much harder and it could crack eventually the sculpture. So you definitely want to remove it as soon as the clay is stiff enough. In the beginning, it's more about the proportion than anything else. Just try and work on the skeleton and don't add too much muscle and mass onto your sculpture. As you guys have seen, if you've watched this YouTube channel for a while, you know that I make plenty of mistakes. And I keep going back and forth with my sculpture because I want to modify various things. So I try and keep things simple because I know I'm going to be changing it later on. And just in case you had a figure like the last figure, the reclining figure, I wanted to make it something else at the end. And I was disappointed that I didn't. So often it's better to be very abstract with your sculptures in the beginning. Remember, detail is something that everybody wants to do, but you have to discipline yourself to not do it in the beginning. Now I have the arms connected. It's a little bit difficult to see exactly what I want. I want it to curve. The spine is actually curved because he has a very denserly type of pose. It's got like a lot of movement, and I need to be able to twist his upper torso in two ways, forward and to the right. So he's got a lot of action in there. It's better to do it early on, but the problem is that the clay is a little bit too soft. If you were to start with an armature, you could get the pose almost right away. That is one of the major disadvantages of working without an armature inside. You could, of course, take water-based clay and make a mold and use an armature, but that adds quite a bit of cost, so I prefer to do things with just water clay and be patient. Let the clay harden up from the ground up, and then you have a good structure to build on. This session is what I would call the first session. It's simply just the proportion, scale, and the skeleton that I want to build. Once you have that, everything else is going to fall into place. It'll be a lot easier. I like to keep things just a little bit under the required amount of clay. That way I can build up. Sculptors generally want to add clay. If you start to get in the habit of removing too much clay, as I tend to do, you lose a lot of time. It's better to be efficient and just add clay. Learn where the muscles are and just add it. You should also have some sort of diagram in front of you that shows all the anatomy. I am considering scanning my Houdon sculpture, which is the écorché that shows all the muscles, and putting it up on my Patreon. So if you guys are interested, you might want to check that out. I'll be doing a scan on YouTube. One of the reasons I use wood skewers is that it helps me with the structure because I'm not using an armature, and that pipe is only holding the back just a little bit so my sculpture doesn't fall down on the floor. But using those skewers lets me keep everything straight the way I want it. The clay has been constantly moving down and I keep pushing it up. That's one of the issues of not having an armature. But I've gotten used to this technique of sculpting, and I try to compensate for it by making things a little bit larger. So if they sink in a little bit, it's not going to hurt it as much. The model has a ponytail, so in a ponytail it helps adhere the head to the body. Now I'm starting to define the muscles, and you can see some of the shapes. The latissimus dorsi is coming quite well, and I am scraping quite a bit because the clay had to firm up so I can add the clay or the muscles on top. So now I can remove a little bit of the base. The base was getting a little bit too wide, and I kept it that way because I wanted to have a lot of support for the body. Even though this is a fairly small sculpture, it's about 25 pounds of clay. And these are the quad muscles. The middle depression is going to be the separation where there's a big tendon that runs in the lateral side of the thigh. I do enjoy sculpting the knee, the patella, and the way the femur and the tibia and the fibula come together. That whole process is really exciting. Notice that I keep a lump of clay next to my base because at this point I'm not really using a lot of clay, and I keep dabbing in there in case I need to use clay. I'm sculpting the gastrocnemius there. Once the clay firms up, it's a little bit harder to, of course, move things around. So the technique is to carve a way to make a direction for the arms and legs. So you really want to fix all of this before you get into this firmness of the clay. You could always get the clay to be completely soft again, but because this clay is a grog clay, it dries a little bit faster. So I don't really mind that. I kind of like it because the grog is going to help the firing process. I'm also lighting the sculpture in a different way. I put a light on the left just to help me see the forms. If you have reflected light on one opposite of your sculpt, it helps to see how the muscles revolve around the body. So that's a little bit of a technique that old masters used to call coloring in sculpture. That is, you put the model and your sculpture in the same sort of light so you can see the effects of light. The gluteus medius and the tensor fasciae lata, and of course the great trochanter, are going to be very obvious on a model that is this fit. That is one of the beauties of having a male model because you can see the muscles a lot more and you learn more about anatomy than you would from a female model. Notice the clay shaper that I'm using. These silicone tools are really good and I like them, but I like the flat, larger ones. And they seem to be very difficult to find for sculptors. So you might want to look for painting silicone tools. When the clay is this wet, it really feels like it's painting. And once the clay firms up, it's difficult to get your tools in there without moving or twisting the clay around. So you have to be very careful because you don't want to hit like an arm and break it off. It will break at this point. So a lot of these sculptures that are terracottas that have like arms stretched out, they're going to dry out really quickly. So you have to be careful. And sometimes you want to modulate that drying ability of the clay by maybe putting a bag over it. The brushes I use are just old bristle brushes. If you see me using a brush, I just dab it with water, and that's how you blend things. And you can control the clay quite a bit. But I don't just depend on the brushes. I like to use all sorts of things to give it a different texture. Everything that comes to the surface, like a bone, I give it a different sort of texture. You don't want to rely on one because even in the human body, when you see a shiny sort of light, usually it means that there's a bone coming to the surface. So you want to give that a different treatment than you would for fat and even muscle. For muscle, I prefer to use uh, strands so I can see where the muscles are going. Every muscle's got an origin and an insertion. And when you look at anatomy, you want to learn about those. I lit the model a little bit different so I could see the reflected light. Hopefully this helps you guys see the sculpture a little bit better. Now at this point I'm removing the pipe. The pipe doesn't really have an armature inside. It's just something that I made to hold the back, and this is going to give it a way of scooping out just a little bit, and I scooped this current hole all the way to the base. So that's kind of an important thing. You probably don't need to hollow this entire sculpture, but I wanted to get a little bit of the base out, and you can see me there just removing it, and I dug it all the way to the base. And then afterwards, all you have to do is fill it in with clay and cover it. I think one of the issues I had before was I made it too thin, and you want to mimic the thickness of the existing clay and get the existing clay of the back nice and wet before you add your clay to cover up that hole. At this point, I'm just doing little tiny details using a dental tool just to give it a variety of line in the sculpture. Try to pay attention to where the scapula is and where the bones are. The structure of the skeleton is almost more important than the myology or the muscles on sitting on the actual body. Once you get that structure down, it's a lot easier to move forward. Want to get some little bit more blends there in the serratus anterior. And a lot of this, having a model that has all of this showing is really quite superb. I really recommend people getting male models for first learning how to sculpt. It's so much better. The little dental tools work great to get into the parts that you can't really get to. It also creates a very different surface than a surface with a cloth or brush. And we're coming towards the end, and I'm just going to let it dry out. And it's going to be that for this video. I really appreciate you guys watching. I hit my 3,000 subscribers, so that's pretty darn good. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you in the next video.